Good afternoon and welcome. Today we're going to discuss difficult conversations and communication with veterans. Military veterans are facing unprecedented challenges as a result of their service to our nation. Their dedication in protecting our freedoms, going undeterred into hostility environments, cannot be overlooked, especially upon returning home. We have to watch out for them. It's time to take action, and it's the very least that we can do. There are more than 2.5 million post 9/11 military veterans that have served our nation, which is less than 1% of the population. 80% of those spent some time in an overseas combat zone. Over 2 million served in Afghanistan and Iraq, spending 1 out of 3 years serving overseas. 60% are under the age of 34, and 22 veterans commit suicide daily, with one occurring roughly every 80 minutes. The number is higher for special forces. 30% of vets have disabilities as results of their service. 13 to 20% are diagnosed with post-traumatic stress syndrome. The VA says about 30% of people who served in combat are dealing with PTSD. We know that PTSD does not have to be an obstacle to a successful life, although we know oftentimes it is. 22% of our vets are diagnosed with depressive disorder, and there are estimated 300,000 post 9/11 veterans who have psychological wounds. So when we talk about communicating and difficult conversations, you can see that they are a very fragile group to communicate with. So today, we're going to talk about how events that occurred in service can affect one's mental, emotional, and physical health, having an effect on communication and sound decision making. Signs and symptoms of irritability and anxiety, deciding on a proper time for an effective communication, questions to avoid asking a veteran, questions to ask a veteran to elicit a conversation and make that connection, threads of an effective communication, and having a difficult conversation with a veteran. There are many things that affect how a person may communicate. It can be physical, it can be emotional, it can be mental. We know that a lot of veterans experience fatigue, difficulty sleeping, increased sweating, increased heart rate, loss of limbs or body parts, closed or open head trauma, increased appetite leading to weight gain, and decreased appetite leading to weight loss. Those are some of the physical. Let's look at some of the mental issues that our vets have. They may have a history of anxiety, irritability, depression, PTSD, drug and or alcohol abuse. And then we have the emotional feeling of detachment, estrangement from others, inability or limited ability to show affection or love, feelings of bleak future, and supervigilance. All of these are going to make it difficult for people to communicate. They may see, it may be pervasive, but we know that it's there. We have to understand why people behave difficult to begin with, because even without being a veteran, we know there are people that are very difficult to communicate with because they have difficult behaviors. Difficult behaviors is often a result of a psychological need for control, recognition, affection, and respect. In various settings, there's going to be different personalities, cultures, family background, and coping skills. Because of all these variables, it's not uncommon to see some conflict with people. Typically, these are not intentional, but a peeling away of layers of these variables causing disagreement. We also know that everyone doesn't like everybody. This is normal. I know I have, in my experience, I've annoyed someone somewhere. However, I typically have, and so do many others, have that keen sense when we are liked or disliked by another person. So we behave accordingly. This may color how we react to that person, setting off a cascade of unpleasant events. Also, we know that some people are not team players and have altruistic views of themselves, doing whatever they need to advance themselves. Quite frankly, we're all difficult at times. A fight with a spouse, not feeling well, having issues with your children, bills that can't be met, or unexpected expenses. Those can cause anxiety that brings out an edginess in everything that we do. But it's typically short-lived. But difficult people exist for more than a day, and we need to deal with them to survive. So, reasons for difficult behaviors. For most, the cause of anger is fear. For others, it's a technique. This may be the way they've always been heard or got their own way. For many, it's a learned behavior. Several reasons for difficult behavior would be excessive stress, whether it's from work or family obligations. Stress can cause people to exhibit difficult behavior and difficulty communicating. They may become anxious and hard to deal with, moody, short-tempered, or critical. Some have personality issues. People with strong personalities tend to butt heads. That can be even more apparent when two people disagree and each wants their own way. Some have triggering events. People who experience verbal abuse or trauma may immediately lash out if they think that type of behavior is being directed towards them. Unresolved conflicts. A tense issue that hasn't been dealt with is the elephant in the room, and the tension can bring irritability and frustration with it. You may see misunderstandings and inability or lack of effort to communicate clearly, and that leads to difficult behavior, especially if someone feels slighted. And then relationship, personal problems, financial problems, sickness, mental health issues, and any number of personal concerns can seep into our behavior any place and cause difficulty communicating. We need to really identify the signs of irritability and anger. I think it's important, and we'll talk about, when is it appropriate to have a conversation with someone? And one of the times it's not is when you see signs of irritability and anger. Irritability can be seen with a short temper, feeling easily annoyed, or having a reaction that's more intense than necessary. Other signs include moodiness, increased sensitivity to sounds and smells, and feeling tense, uptight, touchy, or on edge. Anger. That's a strong feeling of annoyance or displeasure that can lead to aggressive acts. Signs of anger include feeling tension in your jaw, your shoulders, your forehead, your fists, feeling your heart beat faster, your body feeling warm or hot. Then we have aggression, and that's a type of behavior that's often an expression of anger. Aggression can range from hurtful comments to acts of violence. And then inward behavior is a type of anger that's directed internally and can include negative self-talk, dark and depressive thoughts, and punishing yourself. Some things that can cause irritability include everyday annoyances and, like I said, some medical causes or health issues. Some things that can cause anger issues include always feeling angry, feeling that your anger is out of control, and frequently regretting something you've said or done when angry. There are some self-help strategies for managing irritability, and those include Reducing stimulus like coffee, tea, tobacco, drugs, reducing alcohol use, getting enough sleep, identifying what your triggers are, practicing relaxation techniques or mindfulness, trying physical activity, irritability and feeling on edge. So those are some of the things that we can do to help with our irritability. But if you see that a person is starting to become irritable, or you see that there's some anger starting to flourish, that is not a good time to have a conversation with that person. So, a couple things that we need to ask ourselves when we're trying to identify the right time for a difficult conversation would be asking yourself, what frame of mind am I in? How many out there have gone into a conversation not in the right frame of mind and having a negative outcome to that conversation, or the conversation escalating? And clearly it was your frame of mind going into it. So if you say, what frame of mind am I in? And you answer that in a negative tone, it is not time to have that conversation. You need to put that conversation off. On the flip side, you need to ask yourself, what frame of mind is the other person in? And you'll know the frame of mind the other person is by their body behavior, what they're saying, looking at their body language, if they're fidgeting, if they're tense, if their voices are becoming raised, if they are having some repetitive movements like tapping a table or shaking their foot. Those are all cues and signs that maybe that person is starting or is agitated, and it's not a good time to have that conversation. Make sure that when you're having that conversation, you're looking for a calm, quiet location with minimal disturbances. So in the middle of a supermarket is not a good time to have a conversation. When the kids are around may not be a good time to have that conversation. Maybe having some quiet time in your family room later on in the evening with that person might be a better time to have that conversation. So you want to look for calm, quiet location with minimal disturbances. All technology should be off. Neither one of you should have your phones in your hands. Purposely shut your phones down and put them upside down on the table, or put them both in a drawer. So you're not having any technology disturbances that could break that thread of a good conversation. And then allow enough time for discussion. You want to be able to hear both points of view, both sides of the story, both rights and both wrongs. And so you really need to allow time for that discussion. Some conversation do's: be yourself and natural as possible. Show your concern by empathetic listening. Empathetic listening is really keying in to what they're saying. We'll see in a slide or two, but I'll mention it now. Some responses when you're listening empathetically is, I'm hearing what you say, what you're saying is, and you reverberate what they're saying back to them. So I understand that this makes you angry. Those are all empathetic responses, empathetic listening. You also want to keep judgment out of that conversation completely. Remaining calm and be positive and reassuring. I understand what you're telling me, and I'm going to try X, Y, and Z. So let them know that you're positive, you're on their side, you're listening to what they have to say. Empathy is seeing with the eyes of another, listening with the ears of another, and feeling with the heart of another. So we need to talk a little bit about empathy, and that really is another term for active listening. So you want to start at the very top here, hearing content. You want to hear what they have to say. You want to listen for their feelings. Listen to how they're modulating their voice. Do they sound angry, frustrated, terse? Are they talking fast? Look at their body language. Are they leaning in, leaning out, crossing their arms, tapping their feet, tapping the table, rolling their eyes? Those are all body language signs that we can observe. It should be a neutral technique. When you're listening to someone, your hands should be on your lap if you're sitting, leaning forward, making good eye contact. Paraphrasing means you are repeating back to them what they said, what you heard them say. So what I heard you say, Bob, is that you don't like the way I set the table at night. That gives Bob the opportunity to say, yes, you're right. That's what I'm saying. Or no, you've misconstrued that. What I'm saying is, and then they repeat it. And then you paraphrase it again. Identify your own self-awareness. Look at your own body language. Are you feeling judgmental? Can you be neutral in this conversation? And then reflect and question. Question, how is this affecting you? What can I do about this? Reflecting is, when I hear you say this, that makes me feel X, Y, and Z. Clarify the techniques. So what we're going to do is per your suggestion, we're going to try this. And then summarize. It was a good conversation. I understand that you said X, Y, and Z. I fully understand why you're feeling this way. We're going to try doing this a little bit different. I will support you 100%. You know I have your back. That's kind of that thread of conversation, and active listening, and an empathetic approach. We also need to look at the underlying cause and the hidden need. If we look at an iceberg from just on top, we see a very small iceberg. But when we look under that waterline, there's more to that iceberg. That might be the same with our underlying causes. If we look at just the problem that is in our vision, but we really need to look at the rest of the iceberg. What's underneath that water? What else is causing them distress, making them feel stressed or judged? So we really need to look at that underlying cause. Some of the conversations we don't want to argue. At the time that they're discussing, whatever they're discussing, that is their reality. And it's hard to argue with someone when they feel that's their reality. Might they be wrong? Absolutely. But in that time and space, they feel that that's their reality and they are right. So don't argue with them. Listen to what they have to say. Listen empathetically. And then respond appropriately. You don't want to lecture. They are not there to listen to your wealth of information. They are there to sort things out with you. And lecturing is not a good way to do that. If you feel that their life is in danger, when you're having a conversation with them, let's say you're talking to a vet and they have expressed thoughts of suicide, and they ask you to not tell anybody, you can't really agree to that confidentiality because it's really a safety factor. And you can try as hard as you can, and some things will still go wrong. Don't blame yourself, because we know that there's a lot of factors when we're dealing with a veteran that really color the way that they are going to converse with you. You want to stay calm. Don't act defensively. As soon as you start acting defensively, people become judgmental and a wall goes up. You want those walls to be down. And acknowledge the person's feelings. These are some ideas for empathetic approaches versus what we typically might hear. Instead of the emotional validation, you're fine, stop crying, and let's go, try saying, I hear you. Instead of saying, what's wrong with you? If they're upset and crying, say, it's safe with me to feel upset. I understand. Instead of saying, pull it together, say, I can see that this is a big deal for you, so let's talk about that. Instead of saying, this isn't a big deal, say something such as, it makes sense that you're upset. This really mattered to you. Distracting them with other things won't help. What you can say is, I will be there when you're ready. If you want me to stay with you, I will stay with you. If you want me to sit outside the room, I will sit outside the room, but know that I will be there when you're ready. Instead of saying, look at others in the same situation and how they're handling it, that's not what they need to hear, because every situation is different. Even though they may be a vet, they may have the same, same disabilities that the vet is that's sitting next to them. But they're a different human being, so every situation is different. So instead of saying, look at how others are handling this, say, it's safe, it's okay to feel that way. Instead of saying, you know what, you were having such a good day. Now you're making them feel like they ruined it. Instead of saying that, say, I will help you to get through this. You want to use I statements. You statements always sound a little more aggressive. You did this. You made me feel like that. Instead of saying that, it is I'm feeling uncomfortable with the conversation. I feel that you were too sharp with me. You're using those I statements. It's not as aggressive, and you're not pointing fingers at anyone but yourself. You'll get farther that way with that person because they're not going to snap back at you. We talked a little bit about body language, but really in totality, it's all of these. It's your stance, your hand, your arm, and your feet position, your facial expressions, your eye contact, and your paraverbal expressions. So keep an eye on that. It's important to set healthy boundaries. You have to let other people know what the expectations are. My expectations of this conversation is that we're going to come to some agreement on how such and such is going to be handled. Or I understand that you're feeling this way, but my expectations is to help you get better. And I can only help you do that if, and then you set the boundaries. So you want to make sure that you always set those boundaries and let them know. You may have to let them know more than once what those boundaries are. So calming a person with calming phrases, again, empathetic listening. You look really upset. Tell me about it. I'm sorry this is happening to you. What would you like me to do to help you? If you say, again, it's choosing the right words. If you say, what do you want me to do about it? That sounds accusatory and hostile. But if you say, what would you like me to do to help you? It has a whole different flavor. Thank you for sharing your feelings. It's important that I understand you today. It's difficult for people to share their feelings, so do appreciate the fact that they shared them with you. Choose your words carefully. How many times how many of you have said, calm down, to someone who's upset? What does that do? That makes them angrier. That's what we call a trigger phrase. Other trigger phrases are you have to, you can't, you should, sorry, but. Those are all what we call trigger phrases, and it'll escalate and emotionally charge the situation more than it is at that point. We have to be proactive, have a plan, and be prepared for the worst. So if you're talking to a family member, a vet, and it's something that's important, and you have to kind of think of, okay, what am I going to do if this conversation goes south? How am I going to kind of circle back and bring them in so they trust me? So have a plan and be prepared for the worst. They may not like what you have to say, and they may respond very negatively to it. So you have to be prepared for that. Life is not roses. Not every conversation is going to go good. And so you have to be prepared to think that the worst will happen. Empathize. With someone, we've talked about empathy and empathetic responses. Know that empathy is not an agreement, but an acceptance. Don't use I'm sorry to apologize. It's very condescending. When they did a study and a poll on people who had the words say I'm sorry to them versus I apologize. Apologize was softer, kinder, and people were more accepting of it. I know they're just words, but they mean different things to people. So instead of I'm sorry, so and such happened, I apologize that you had that experience or whatever it is. It has to be genuine. People know when they're being patronized. So make sure that you're genuine about it. Don't overpromise anybody. That's just going to fuel the fire. So make sure that when you're talking to someone that, and you're setting those boundaries, that you're also not overpromising people. You're going to lose credibility if you can't follow through with what was promised. So make sure that, that your promises are within reason. When we look at conflict resolution, there's always two sides to it. There's the conflict, of course. Then there's the personal needs, and then there's the practical needs. Our personal needs are, I want to be valued, I want to be respected, I want to be listened to, I want to be understood, and I want to contribute to the discussion, the conversation. The practical side of conflict resolution is we need to resolve that conflict. We have to keep the discussion focused on the problem. We can't let that get away on us. And we have to make sure that we're able to problem solve that conflict. Most of the time it can be done. Sometimes it can't be done easily and it takes a little bit longer. But that really should be the end result, is to solve that problem. But this is very important, these personal needs. If you can't get these, the practical needs won't be met. So the 5 steps in conflict resolution is define that source of conflict. What's the argument about? What's going on? Look beyond the first incident. Request solutions. Identify those solutions from both disputants that they can support. You need to get both sides of the story. You need to get conversations from both people. So we can understand, as part of the process of resolution, we understand what the problem is. If we're only hearing one side of the story, we really can't solve that. There's not going to be a resolution to that. It might be one, but it might be very short-lived. So we really have to think about, what is that resolution? And how can I support that? If you go to, there's tons of resources for veterans. And there's a website called Start the Conversation. And it's difficult conversation starters. And they're categorized. And this one is for mental health, conversation starters for attempted suicide, risk of suicide, and after suicide attempt. There's conversation starters for use and abuse of drugs and alcohol. There's conversation starters for veterans and fire safety. So if you need to have a conversation with your loved one, family member who's a veteran, and you don't know how to start that conversation, go to difficult conversations, or start conversations.veteranscrisisline.net. And then it'll give you the options for suicide, drug, alcohol abuse, or veteran and firearm safety. And that will give you guides on how to start those conversations. The one thing I want you to know is that obviously suicide is a very difficult conversation, but talking about suicide will not give someone the idea of ending their life. One does also not need to be mentally ill to attempt suicide. People who die by suicide typically hint to someone they're considering suicide. And even those who appear determined to end their life can be saved. With just one conversation, you can make a difference. So I think it's important for you to identify when someone is at risk for suicide, and you get that conversation going or get the help that they need. So our takeaways from today: there are many changes that veterans experience that may change the way they communicate or understand communication. And these can be emotional, physical, and mental health changes. We also need to be aware of how the veteran is feeling before we engage in conversation that may cause anxiety and anger with a veteran. And always work with the confines of empathy and try to understand what they are feeling, and know the time and space to have these difficult conversations. Let them know that you're supporting them, and also know that there are a lot of resources for veterans and families. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I'd like to say Blessed Veterans Day to all of our veterans out there who have given up time, energy, resources, and maybe some of who they are to protect our country. You're honored every day in our hearts. And thank you today for joining us.